We've spent like a weekend basically in Rome, and the idea is that by looking at the culture and context of Rome, the theory is that we would understand something of history and everything of what took place in the first century and how that influenced the New Testament writers. Okay. We started off by looking at context and how understanding context is absolutely essential for understanding anything. Remember on that first night we had that teaching on context. Because if we don't understand context, we can misunderstand. I can misunderstand you without understanding your context. And it's the same with the scriptures. The goal of this teaching has been to look at the culture of Rome and see how understanding this influences our reading of the Bible. Okay, we then went on to look at the history of Rome, the traditions, the legends upon which it is built, and look at the lineage of how it went from its early formation through into the various different ruling individuals, the emperors, the Caesars, and so on, and eventually into the popes. And we looked at a couple of legends, a couple of traditions that influenced, well, a couple of traditions upon which early Rome was built. I don't know if you remember, but there were two, weren't there? One was about a guy called Anchises and his son Aeneas. Anchises was saw by Aphrodite on Mount Ida, and then Aeneas was born. So Aeneas was quite literally the produce or the offspring of a union between God and man, or a goddess and man. And then we looked at another one, which was the birth of Romulus and Remus, the famous founders of Rome, who were considered to be the offspring of a virgin, Rhea, a Vestal virgin, and the god Mars. And the reason we looked at those was because that informed the whole culture of Rome. Okay, so what we've got right from the get-go is we have a culture that is founded on the understanding that its founders were in part divine. We've got at the formation of Rome, we've got a story of a virgin birth giving birth to then its founders. And Romulus, who became the first ruler of Rome, Rome is named after him, he actually ascended, according to tradition, to be sitting up in the heavens with the gods. And from that point forward, every ruler of Rome was considered to be divine. Julius Caesar himself believed that he was offspring also of the gods. And so every ruler of Rome was destined for divinity. And we see within even the coins and all the rest of it, they're even called sons of gods. Okay. Now, why is this important? Because when we look at Christianity, when we look at Judaism, there are many aspects within the biblical worldview, Jesus or Yeshua being the Son of God, the story of Mary as the Virgin giving birth. These things are not difficult for the Roman pagan mindset to absorb. Do you see what I mean? It's not difficult to absorb these things because they are so paralleled with what these guys already believed and the culture that they already believed. And it's important to understand that whilst we look at it and we say it's all myth and legend and it's all nonsense, for them, actually, there was an element of truth. So when this new religion or this new religious idea comes up, actually, they can see parallels with what they already believed, and it's not so difficult to absorb. When you consider that in light of the fact that the Greek-Roman world, the pagan world, was polytheistic, it's not difficult to then accept that actually the gods of this country or the god of this country or this people could just stand side by side with the gods of what we already believe in, the gods of the other countries. And when you believe that there are so many gods, even if you believe somewhere along the line that it goes back to a single point, there's an ultimate truth, you can simply see or hear that the legends from Rome or the legends from Greece or the legends from Babylon, all the rest of it, it's all the same thing, just told from a slightly different cultural background. These are the legends from the Jewish God. These are the legends from the Babylonian God. These are the legends from the Greek God. Does this make sense? So it all starts to overlay and it all appears to be able to blend together. So at the birth of Christianity, one of the things we looked at is how the Roman pagan influence had taken aspects of Christianity, and the lines then became blurred between that and a lot of the pagan beliefs that were already in place. It made it much, much more straightforward for it all to come together. So this is kind of one of the key aspects to understanding it to begin with. What we really wanted to do was look at the attitude of the Romans towards Christians and why they had that attitude. What was the attitude of Romans towards the Jewish people and why? How did this then influence the writings of the New Testament? And what sort of influence did that have maybe a couple of centuries later on when Christianity became sort of the legal religion or faith system of Rome? So, as one of the difficulties we have when we look at Christianity and Judaism, and I stated this previously, is that in our mind, 2,000 years later, they are two entirely separate religious systems, two entirely different sets of beliefs which look very, very different from each other. And the flaw that we can make is that, or the error we fall into, is believing that was the same back in the first century, and it wasn't. Christianity and Judaism really wasn't as it looks today. Early Christianity was simply a branch or a sect within Judaism. The first so-called Christians weren't Christians at all, they were Jews who believed that Jesus or Yeshua was the Messiah. They were Messianic Jews. So all their practices, their worship, their lifestyle and everything else looked entirely Jewish. But they believed that Jesus, Yeshua, was the fulfillment of the Messianic prophecies. When Gentiles came into that faith, their worship practices didn't look Christian. They rejected the pagan worship practices and lifestyles and actually then adopted the, I'm going to say, biblical lifestyles, because the Bible explains, the Torah, the Hebrew Scriptures and all the rest of it explains what a lifestyle that is pleasing to the God of Israel looks like. And that would have included feast days, that would have included moral laws, that would have included even food laws and all the rest of it, all of these things. And that's what would have happened. Now, from a Roman perspective, it is easy to accept the Jewish faith in as much as it relates just to a specific ethnic group. Okay, so the Jews had been part of the Roman Empire since 168 BC when the first emissaries had come across. And even though their concept of the one true God, they were monotheistic in nature, and monotheism of itself is an offence to polytheism. Okay, because polytheism is accepting of all, but monotheism states that your gods are not gods at all, there is only one God. Now that's an offence, and it's still an offence in the world today, isn't it? The monotheism of Judaism or Christianity is an offence to the world today because it means that we're not tolerant of all these other gods that everybody wants to worship. So monotheism is an offence to polytheism. However, it can be tolerated by polytheism when it can be attributed to a specific ethnic group. So the Jews can be tolerated because from a Roman point of view, you can kind of go, well, that's a Jew. We can tolerate what they believe because that's a Jew. Okay? So in that sense, it's not so much of a problem. The difficulty is when a Gentile converts to the Jewish faith. Because when a Gentile then converts to the Jewish faith, they're not that distinct ethnic group, and suddenly the practices of this new faith mean that they end up rejecting the worship practices of their culture, their family, their friends. They can no longer go to all the feasts, the orgies, whatever, that their families would have been a part of, because they know that it's idolatry and it's worship of other gods. And that the Judeo-Christian faith, if you will, the biblical faith, actually says that this is bad, this is wrong, this is not pleasing to God. So the Jewish faith or the biblical faith, when it relates just to Jews, could be tolerated as a specific ethnic group. But when people converted, and you could then call them Christians, if you will, Gentile believers in the Jewish faith, this then becomes an offence. So immediately you've got this enmity between the Roman pagan society and the people, the Gentiles, the non-Jews that were converting, because it means rejecting family, it means rejecting friends, it means rejecting the divinity of the emperor, which could effectively amount to treason, and it means rejecting the gods of Rome and preferring the God of Israel as the one true God. So this causes a problem. Do you see how that causes an issue? Even bigger problem then is when the Jews in Judea and Samaria, in resistance to Rome, in resistance to the gods of Rome and all the rest of it, they start rebelling. And so there's these constant rebellions, and we looked at the Arch of Titus and we looked at other things, and we see how actually Rome went in and crushed the uprisings and brought all these slaves and everything out, didn't it? So you're then a Gentile convert to the Jewish faith in Rome, but then there is an increasing hostility towards Jews because of what is happening, because of the uprising that's constantly going on. So as a Gentile, you might believe in the Jewish faith, but now you don't want to be associated with the Jews because there's hostility to them because of the way they are resisting Roman pagan culture. So you've got a problem, haven't you? And this is in large part what Paul is trying to address, particularly in Romans 9 to 11. He's trying to explain to these Gentile converts that they are not Jews. However, they can't separate themselves in identity entirely from Jews, despite the fact that as a Roman Christian or as a Roman Gentile convert, I would want to distance myself because there's a social stigma attached to being Jewish. It's hard enough being Christian alone, rejecting all the religious systems of the empire, but then to be doubly associated with being a Jew or being connected with the Jews, it's a double problem. Does that make sense? And this is really where we get the birth of things like replacement theology. Anti-Semitism predates the first century. It goes all the way back to Abraham with Isaac and Ishmael. But what we've got here is we've got another cultural setup which is anti-Semitic of its nature, but then as the number of Gentile converts increases and we have all the social issues within Rome, this disassociation with the Jews eventually, generation after generation, breeds replacement theology. How to understand our identity separate from the Jewish people. And we can see evidence of it actually throughout the early church fathers, Origen of Alexandria, Justin Martyr, and so on. I'm not going to go into all the quotes, but there's clear evidence right from the first century of how they didn't understand the relationship between Jew and Gentile and how this caused hostility. Not just division, but hostility. And latterly what happened is that in order to look distinct from one another, both the Jews and the latterly Christians created worship practices in opposition to one another. So whilst the Jewish worship practices stuck firmly to the scriptures, the Christian worship practices, influenced almost entirely by the church in Rome, developed worship practices which showed them as distinct. And this is where we get things like the move from the Sabbath to Sunday worship. We get movement from the biblical calendar, charting dates for things like Easter or Pentecost and Shavuot and Passover and all the different appointed times. They get moved from the biblically appointed times to things that fall in line with the Roman calendar. And so progressively we move away from the biblical faith. Does that make sense? Eventually what we get to is we see Constantine, who gets hailed as this hero of Christianity. And he gets hailed as a hero of Christianity because effectively he legalizes Christianity. Before Constantine, there are many different persecutions that take place of Christians in Rome because of all these different socio-economic issues, all the cultural issues. And he has this vision of the sign of the X or Christos, and he sees it associated with the sun, and you've got all these different pagan worships which associate sun as a deity. So he sees these two symbols together and figures that this is a divine sign which points him to the God of the Christians as being the right God. And from that point forward, he then says, okay, I'm going to win this battle in the name of Jesus, and Christianity gets adopted. But it doesn't get adopted in a pure form. It gets adopted in this syncretized, blended understanding. Because there's so many parallels between what the pagan beliefs are and what the Judeo-Christian faith is, it's easy to bring the two together. And because there's a desire to be distinct from the Jewish, purely Jewish faith, they're keen to create that distinction even further. And actually, as we look into the Roman church, if you will, I'm cautious not to talk specifically about Catholic, but the Roman-influenced church, we can see that there are many influences in the practices of the Roman Church that are taken from other religious systems. The style of dress, the style of the basilicas, the houses of worship, the imagery, the statues and the figures. You can see that so much influence has come out of Greek and Roman mythology as much as anything else. And the styles of worship and stuff are taken all out of that place. People are very quick to point the finger firmly at the Catholic Church as being this blended, syncretized pagan religion. What people miss is that even in the Protestant Reformation, whilst many of the unbiblical heresies of the Catholic Church were rejected, there were still many aspects that carried through into the Protestant Reformation. There's still issues over the times and dates of feasts, what the Bible says about Sabbath and Sunday worship, what the Bible talks about in many other worship practices. And I'm not going to go word for word down, sort of list for list down all the different ones. It's very easy to point the finger at the Catholic Church, but what we need to understand is that the Protestant Church, in large part, is still a long way from the biblical truth. And replacement theology is a classic example of that. People have still founded churches with that understanding of rejection of everything Jewish and rejection of everything. Does that make sense? Yeah. So really the whole point, well, not the whole point, but one of the key aspects of this whole journey that we've gone on through Rome is understanding that by seeing all the cultural things, all the religious influences and everything in the first century, we realise that a lot of the contemporary understandings and contemporary translations of the New Testament actually misunderstand that. We see it only through the eyes of our modern world. We see it only through the understanding of the church fathers who've taught and taught and taught. And if people like Luther and Calvin and all the rest of it taught with that replacement theology and anti-Semitic edge, and our teachings are based on the understanding and interpretation of them, we will come out with a flaw, because theirs were built on a false understanding as well, going right back to the early church fathers. We can see in things like Tertullian and other early church fathers around about the 2nd, 3rd century, them talking very specifically about needing to reject pagan practices within the church, within the body of Christ. The problem is that several generations later, those practices which they talked against, I'm talking about things like the giving of gifts around the winter solstice time and stuff like that. It's very explicitly stated. And I know in our culture today, Christmas is one of those contentious issues. But what they describe is how the pagan worship practices slowly influence the church calendar and the church practices. We argue against things like that today because we don't see how the seeds were planted and how it spread into the church. We don't know the history and the things that were taught by the early church fathers in rejection of these things. So that really is sort of sums up what we were seeing. We saw all of the idolatry within the Vatican. We saw the Colosseum and understood that the Colosseum and the Via Appia Antica, where they hung the bodies of the dead Christians alongside the roads. We saw all of those things as evidence of how Christians were viewed. We saw the Jewish quarter, the Jewish ghetto, and we heard how the ghetto was formed in the first place in order to separate the Jews from the rest of the city. And finally looking at the pantheon with the temple to all gods, and how actually, in order to deal with the pagans and all the rest of it, the temple to all gods of the pantheon was cleansed, as it were, but the biblical model is to raze these things to the ground rather than to build upon them. And every obelisk we saw, which had Greek-Roman mythology on the bottom and an Egyptian thing going up and then a cross on the top, People can see that as the sign of the victorious cross, the victorious Christ, victorious Christianity. But in actual fact, it demonstrates much more clearly that what the majority of the church has been built on for the last 2,000 years is a blending of ideas and systems. I firmly believe today that God is waking people up, not just here, but all around the world, to realising that there's a truth that's contained in black and white there for all to see within the Scriptures, that if we can view it without the spectacles of 2,000 years of theology and teaching, we can actually see that the biblical model for church, if you will, the biblical model for understanding the Scriptures looks a little bit different from where the church has got it to today.